I am very excited for our next speaker, who's going to be talking about play in other unexpected places, and in this case, prisons. Drawing on years of research, Constance Steinkuehler, professor of informatics at the University of California, Irvine, awesome school, and a frequent speaker, keynoter here at the Games for Change Festival, and I'm so honored that she came back to join us today. She's going to examine how games can create connection, emotional regulation, and learning in correctional settings, challenging assumptions about rehabilitation and the role of play in some of society's most restrictive environments. So please join me in welcoming Constance Steinkuehler.
Okay, what was my walk-on song? Kidding. So a couple years ago, I was here talking about online toxicity. I mostly spent my career studying online games and teenagers. So we did this large study looking at online toxicity among adolescents. And the net result was two findings that broke my heart and almost had me leave games as a medium, which I did not do. But the first was that online game spaces in the last 10 years have become really not just unregulated, but dysregulated spaces. And the second is that victimization or being a bystander, simply witnessing harm, and the harm we're talking about is not just toxicity, but hate speech, hate-based harassment, and white supremacy, actually massively increases the odd ratio that you will engage in it. So it's kind of this weird situation where harm begets harm, right? It's not new news for all of you who have a background in psychology or therapeutic arts. But after that study, I ended up moving my work into the margins. And I think a lot of us here have, just looking at the talks and the presentations on the program. And for me, that was moving into prison spaces. I started, actually it came about because I started receiving this kind of cascade of letters, handwritten letters from inmates at San Quentin. San Quentin is one of the most notorious prisons in America. It's the oldest prison in California. It was built in 1852 by mostly indentured or kind of enslaved. Basically, prisoners had to build their own cages and then move themselves into it. So I started receiving these handwritten letters about a game program that was going up there and reporting on how much this meant to people. And first letter, second letter, third letter, fourth letter. Eventually, I just got on the phone and said, I need to come see this. And that's not an easy process to get into a prison. But I talked my way in. I went in to watch the program. And what I saw there absolutely moved me. I walked into a prison with all of the kind of stereotypes you might have about prison. And yes, it's scary and it's paramilitary, and I could say a lot about that. But I went to spend a day gaming with inmates, about 250 inmates and 2 correction officers, and playing D&D, Scrabble, all sorts of games. But what struck me and moved me the most was that after studying online spaces that felt so dysregulated, being in a space where people are under some of the worst of circumstances, they have been literally removed from society. We literally cage them and put them in the margins to signal that you are not wanted here, which, by the way, happens to be a wildly damaging thing to do to people. But instead of finding a lot of fear or trepidation or dysregulation, I found massive regulation, a space of shared warmth and collective joy. I found, among other things, tables of gamers that were gaming across institutional lines, so correction officers gaming with inmates. I found volunteers sitting among the inmates, cheek to jowl, which is not typical in prisons. I also saw players that were playing at mixed race tables. And if you know much about prison, the racial divisions there are built into the system. If I as a white person were to cross a yard in, say, the Chicano area, chances are I might get a beat down, even worse, right? So they're really, really entrenched. And yet here we are in this game space where people are playing in mixed groups, and there's this feeling of just sort of a shared affective positiveness, which Nick talks about, and it's the power of games. So about 2 years later, about a year later, I started teaching. I joined what our university calls the Lifted program. We're the only UC school so far that offers a BA program inside institutions, prison institutions. It's offered at Donovan. Donovan is a very different prison in San Diego. This is a prison built in the 1980s to account for all of the bodies that Reagan and other sort of politicians put into jails in California, mostly due to really intense laws, punishments for drug-related crimes. So Donovan is a very different structure there, and I was teaching a course on the sociology of games. And I gotta tell you, one of the greatest accomplishments of my career, I think, is actually talking my way into bringing games into Donovan Prison. It's a prison that has all the way up to level 4, so a very different kind of atmosphere than San Quentin. But we taught sociology of game, and again there I taught a 3-hour class at night, and I had my students all, yes, we would lecture and do activities, but I made them all play based on the idea that we can't talk about games if you're not playing them. And afterwards, the letters I received from them, handwritten letters again, about how much it meant for them to spend even if 90 minutes together and feel safe, feel regulated, feel seen, and feel human again, made them feel more connected to the world outside. So, you know, we think of games as sort of rare in prison spaces. It turns out they're not necessarily. Chess, for example, has a really long history in prison, as does D&D, one of the world's best escape hatches when you are experiencing the catastrophe of life sometimes. And we've also had really interesting projects over the years that have focused on carceral spaces. Really in the 1980s, games were used a little bit like a carrot or a stick, right? So they were there for diversion and for compliance. But projects also emerged that were used to help sort of structure the conversation between young youth offenders and their therapists. About, much later in like the mid-2010s, we saw projects that were about mostly focusing on younger offenders, looking at sort of decisions and consequences. And then later, this is one of my favorites, a game that was produced to help fathers and their children during visitation time, being able to contain a space where they could talk, because that's a really difficult activity for both parties. And since then, some great ones, world's best board design ever, teaching, right, thank you, teaching women about reproductive health and STDs inside a women's prison. And even now an iOS game, iOS-based game, which is really rare. You can't take technology in prisons typically, except their own tablets, which they have. But this was about sort of thinking about decisions post-release, and again, about decisions and consequences. And I have to give a shout out, man, Rikers is actually, this article came out in April, is actually using games in Rikers prison again. Mostly here, if you hear COs and admin talk about it, they think of it in terms of carrot and stick still, but my suspicion is that it goes much deeper. But my own work started here at San Quentin. And what we've been doing over the last 2 years is a community-led research program, meaning that I am designing the study that reflects what they report are the big sort of impacts that their program is having. And I'm also running a very slow paper-based correspondence-first teaching research methods to those very same teams so they can learn how to actually evaluate their own work. And it looks something like this, blah, 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 blah. I mean, if you're nerdy, it's a staggered waitlist, RCT, where we're gonna talk about like individual impact over time, how does it work longitudinally for a person, but also we set it up so we can look at how do you feel when you come versus when you didn't come, and also how do groups feel comparing those who do not attend but are waiting to get in and those who have attended, right? Super fancy, and I love all that. But I'm also setting it up as a kind of context to do a lot of ethnomethodological work on the play factor in games and on what it is that might be having these positive outcomes, right? We're looking at things like intergroup anxiety. How racist are you? How triggered do you get at the idea of being the only person of your race category among a sea of faces that are different? Or positive and negative affect and social connectedness. And this one is my favorite, and I want to spend some time there. But to get there, I want to talk a bit about what we think is happening in this space. So first sort of drivers at the very top. First, it's peer-led, meaning that the incarcerated individuals who are going to be the recipients of the design are actually the designers themselves of the program. I have spent my career doing games for impact, and I have myself, so I'm not pointing fingers here, but it's really easy for us to fall into a pattern where we think we know what a community needs. And it's very hard to shift our mentality to think about it more like a kind of community organizing, where the first thing you do is you go to the community and you say, what do you need? What can I help with, right? So here it's already baked in. They know what they want, and now they're asking for help building it. The second part is we play cooperative and competitive games. I'm going to argue that it doesn't have to be cooperative for it to be wildly positively social. And third, it's an open door policy. They have this one rule about coming to their event, which, by the way, it's about 200, 250 per month. It's a monthly half-day event. The waiting list is upward now of 800 to 1,000 people, and that's about half the population of the prison. That's how popular this is. So to go back, their one policy is that everybody plays with everybody. So, if you come in and you're about to sit down at Scrabble and you're like, oh, hell no, he's in a different gang, I'm not playing, I'm not doing this. They're like, totally cool. I hope you'll come back when you change your mind, because everybody here just kind of plays wherever they feel like. They choose games, not who they sit with. So those are three what I would call kind of the big, what I see as like sort of the program variables that matter in my mind a lot. Now, let's dive a little bit into the cooperative competitive games. And I'm so grateful to go after Nick Fortuno, and also terrified because he's amazing. But there's a lot of really interesting things that games do from a sociological perspective. So games, we know that they're magic circles, so they're bounded spaces. It gives us a shared focus where everyone is attending to the same thing, and we're kind of dependent on each other for the game to keep going. But as Suits argues, right, they have a lot of unnecessary challenge. Well, when you put all this together, it means you've got this kind of container for social interaction that also generates friction and hot moments, right? And Goffman points us to the fact that not only do they generate hot moments, friction, but everyone wants the game to continue, which means that we're kind of managing the friction and repairing it, right? We're kind of figuring out ways to make it work. We use laughter, we use, shared eye gaze, etc. But games create this space that actually ends up engendering what we call like friction and repair. So Goffman writes this beautiful book called Encounters, where he literally uses games as kind of a petri dish, a container just to talk about everyday social interactions, because games end up being a more structured sort of form, but actually represents social interactions generally, right? Well, turns out that's really important, and it's not just important because it generates a feeling of collective warmth, but it also does something really deep. My background is cognitive science. It does something really deep in terms of emotional co-regulation. So, emotional regulation for people comes out of it's not an innate sense, it's something that emerges between the very early interactions between an infant and their care provider. So whenever there's this sort of misstep or mishap or misunderstanding, the baby wants something and the mom doesn't understand it, or the father, wants to keep going and the kid is like dysregulated and just needs to stop and freak for a minute, right? When those moments happen, it's not the friction that matters, it's the fact that it gets repaired in the interaction. Meaning that, let's say, you're my father and you're playing with me and my arms are waving wildly and I grab your hair and pull it and you go, ow! The child will literally throw their arms up to protect themselves. Oh God, this is terrible. The one person I depend on is like, just said ow and made an angry face at me. But the next moment is what matters. The owl goes away, the parent, and then it's repaired, right? Their gaze is back on each other and they're back into this sort of rhythmic kind of movement where they're in sync again. And what comes from that is the sense that we hopefully all get that, number one, that moments of mismatch, those little moments of friction, can actually be repaired, that it's repairable, and that I am actually capable of doing that. And so that emotional regulation inside the person actually has origins in the social. In fact, I would argue, frankly, this is a cocktail hour talk, but I would definitely argue that almost all of cognition starts on the social plane long before it becomes on the internal plane. But it's to say that creating this kind of space where friction and repair happens in everyday easy ways, right, actually leads toward a kind of internal emotional co-regulation and self-regulation. And the downwind effect are really important. This is where we get our sense of a coherent world, that I see the world the way you see the world, and we can, or at least enough where we can get by in the world, we can make sense of each other. We can proceed as if we have an internal state of mind that's shared. It's that shared sense of the world, this like lightweight feeling of fellowship, of mutual respect. And I would even use the word kinship. I mean, Goffman and others use this word solidarity, but these days I save that word for when I'm shouting on the streets of LA against ICE who won't get the fuck out of our city. Sorry. Little spicy up here right now. So I'm gonna hold on to my favorite word to shout instead of like other epithets. So I'm gonna, instead of solidarity, I wanna use the word kinship. Kinship, right? That's kind of a big one. Especially when what I'm actually studying and talking about is not these sort of friction and repairs that are like fisticuffs, like you want a piece of this, and you're like, I do want a piece of this. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about things like, I say a word that kind of puts you off and you're like, and then we sort of move on, or we make a joke, and it's okay. I can be a little different than you, and we can be together, right? You can be a little different than me. You don't have to see the world the way I do, and we can get on with business, right? So this word kinship is really important. I want to pick that up. But last I want to talk about sort of this reduced prejudice. So Allport, really important scholar, did a lot of work on what he calls intergroup contact as a remediation of intergroup anxiety and intergroup bias. And here's the idea, that when you have, and it's usually in-group, out-group, it could be race and ethnicity, it could be gang affiliation, it could be gender identity, it could be political viewpoint, right? Whatever that main division is, when you have conditions where there is intergroup cooperation and there is equal status, like in a game, we're all players in the game, where you have common goals. Here it doesn't need to be the common goal in the game, just the common goal that we're gonna have fun together. We're just gonna get through the game okay, right? And finally, institutional support, as in the spaces that I'm showing you about prisons, right, where they're allowing this to happen. Some really important work gets done, and that is that you start seeing a reduction in prejudices against the out-group, right? And I say against the out-group because it's like racism. It's not a black person's problem, it's a white person's problem, right? So you're dealing with the in-group, the majority group, and trying to figure out ways to tamp down their anxiety that, yes, it's okay, you can manage this. You don't have to be only with white people to handle it. So what you end up seeing is that time and again, you get this reduced sense of intergroup anxiety, this reduced prejudice. And this has, probably, 50 years of research behind it now, especially in sort of the ways you can really design it to be most effective. But my point being that you end up with something that is reduced prejudice, and it's built into just the very program that they designed intuitively. So going back to kinship, why should you care, right? I don't know how many of you know anyone or have anyone that's in your social network or family or friends that are incarcerated. It's an unusual space to study this, but I would argue that you probably, like me, have a little bit of a sense that our social fabric is kind of frayed right now, right? I mean, yeah, so there's that. And I guess I would just argue, kind of just pick up on Father Greg Boyle. How many of you are familiar with Homeboy Industries? Homeboy, or as we like to do it, boom, Father Greg Boyle. That's my GTA version of him. Kurt Squire, my husband and better half, who's back there with my two amazing sons. Hi, you knew I was gonna do that. We have been teaching at Homeboy Industries. We're actually teaching a game design studio class among gang-affiliated street kids in LA, and it's been amazing. But to go back, Homeboy Industry is the largest and, dare I say, the most successful gang intervention, rehabilitation, and re-entry program in the world. And it is based on one single really, really fucking simple idea, and that is radical kinship. Radical kinship. There is no one outside the circle. Think about your circle. Yeah, there's no one outside that circle, right? So here's what Father Greg would argue, and it's this. Kinship is not a concept, it's a practice. It's the ultimate weapon system against the illusion that we're separate. When we practice it, the walls come down, right? When we're able to understand that, like, the thing that you find so offensive is also part of you. I mean, I've been reading Baldwin right now, which is an incredible gift to the world. And he writes about how, white people, we will not get past these moments, this division, until white people come to actually accept who they are, embrace who they are, and actually love themselves despite it. That there is this thing we have to do, and I would call it kinship here. So I know that's grand and lofty, but I think we kind of need some grand and lofty thrown into some of our play spaces, especially today. Final moment, I just want to thank my partners. Quentin, Skunkworks, if you have $5, they could use it. $5 inside there, they eat on $4.50 a day. Yet they're still doing this kind of work. My interns, and the small grants I've gotten from my own campus to let me do work that is risky and really, really worth it for me. Oh, and the references are right there, if you'd like that too. So thank you.